On February 14, 1943, the U.S. Army faced a catastrophe at Kasserine Pass that nearly destroyed the Allied cause in North Africa. While American soldiers retreated in chaos, a bitter truth was forming behind the scenes. Eisenhower and his American command were being subjected to secret, biting contempt by the British High Command. Was the collapse at Kasserine merely a failure of the men on the ground? Or was it the inevitable consequence of a fractured command structure, where the British elite secretly mocked their own supreme Allied commander? The Tunisian landscape in early 1943 had become a nightmarish quagmire, where torrential winter rains turned the earth into a vast, impassable morass that stalled the Allied advance and allowed German forces to fortify their positions with terrifying speed. By mid-February, the Allied front was a disjointed patchwork of responsibility, characterized by an absence of unified command that would soon be exposed in the most unforgiving manner imaginable. Major General Kenneth Anderson, commanding the British First Army in the north, was forced to coordinate with French forces that were critically undersupplied, while the untested U.S. Second Corps, under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, held an impossibly wide 50-mile front in central Tunisia. The structural flaws in the American defensive posture were not merely matters of misfortune, but clear indicators of a command culture that had not yet reconciled its theoretical training with the harsh realities of a maneuver war against the Wehrmacht. Fredendall had opted to isolate his units on high-ground features like Jebel Souda and Jebel La Souda, leaving wide, unprotected gaps that negated any possibility of mutual support. This fragmentation of forces into small, disconnected penny packets meant that when the German 5th Panzer Army launched its massive armored thrust through the Fade and Mazilla passes on that fateful February 14th, the American response was predictably disjointed. The first shock hit the U.S. 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A at Sidi Bouzid, where the German tactical proficiency quickly overwhelmed the American positions. It was an agonizing display of how theoretical rigidity, when confronted by a fluid and aggressive enemy, leads directly to operational paralysis. Instead of a concentrated counterattack, the American units were fragmented, and their subsequent efforts to rally on February 15th and 16th resulted only in mounting casualties and a retreat that threatened to devolve into a total rout toward the town of Spitla. As the situation deteriorated, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel personally took control of the offensive on February 19th, cutting through the strategic Kasserine Pass with a ruthless focus on the Allied supply hubs at Tebessa. The crisis was complete, and the vulnerability of the Allied front line had been laid bare for the entire world to see. For the British High Command, this was not just a tactical setback. It was confirmation of their deepest, most private suspicions about the competence of their American partners. The British professional elite, led by figures like Field Marshal Alan Brooke, had long maintained a cold, analytical distance regarding the Americans. In their view, forged in the crucible of combat since 1939, the British were the battle-hardened veterans, while the Americans were little more than well-meaning amateurs. This wasn't merely a difference in training, it was a fundamental disagreement on the nature of warfare itself, with the British favoring a methodology of methodical planning, centralized artillery control, and concentrated fire which the Americans had yet to master. Brooke's personal journals reveal a biting, relentless critique of Eisenhower's leadership that went far beyond mere professional disagreement. He noted with palpable frustration that Eisenhower, as a general, seemed a hopeless proposition, frequently burying himself in the political complexities of coalition management while neglecting the technical requirements of battlefield command. To Brooke, Eisenhower's limited experience, specifically his lack of actual battalion or regimental command in combat, rendered him fundamentally ill-equipped to direct the large-scale maneuvering of armies in the North African theater. The disdain extended even to General George Marshall, the man responsible for the American buildup. Brooke, writing in his diary, admitted that while he found Marshall to be a gentleman, he was entirely unimpressed by his strategic acumen. The British leadership genuinely believed that the American command team, from Marshall on down to the field commanders in Tunisia, was plagued by a systemic lack of the specific expertise required to defeat an enemy as formidable as the Wehrmacht. This cultural friction permeated the staff and field ranks, finding expression in some of the most scathing remarks of the war. In the spring of 1943, among British and French officers, a cruel, mocking shorthand began to circulate, describing the American soldiers as our Italians. It was a devastating insult, implying that the Americans were militarily incompetent, incapable of sustained combat, and destined to be a burden on the Allied cause, much as they perceived the Italians to have been earlier in the Desert Campaign. Central to this breakdown was the conduct of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose leadership of the U.S. Second Corps had become a lightning rod for the criticism that the Americans were unready. Fredendall harbored a deep-seated Anglophobia, refusing to coordinate effectively with the British or French, and his operational decisions often seemed aimed more at maintaining distance from his allies than at winning the battle. Most infamously, he chose to operate not from the front lines, but from a heavily fortified headquarters dug into a deep mountain ravine near Tebessa, which his own men wryly nicknamed Speedy Valley. The commitment of 200 engineers for 3 weeks to construct this buried fortress was a strategic misallocation of resources that shocked Eisenhower when he finally inspected the site. From this distant, subterranean command post, Fredendall issued orders that were frequently confusing, contradictory, and detached from the reality of the fighting. He actively bypassed his subordinate commanders, creating a climate of mistrust and operational stagnation that crippled the effectiveness of the U.S. Second Corps at the exact moment it needed to be most resilient. The failure at Kasserine was not exclusively an American endeavor. General Kenneth Anderson, the British commander, exacerbated the chaos by fragmenting the American 1st Armored Division and parceling its elements out as piecemeal reinforcements for British units. This decision stripped the Americans of their last cohesive mobile strike force and fueled the American belief that the British High Command viewed them as little more than spare parts for their own forces rather than as a sovereign, capable ally. This tension created a vicious cycle of mutual recrimination, where every Allied failure was pointed to as proof of the other's inadequacy. The sheer scale of the defeat, 3,000 killed and wounded, and the loss of nearly 200 tanks, was a brutal awakening that forced Eisenhower to confront the limitations of his diplomatic approach. He was finally forced to acknowledge that his desire to maintain Allied harmony through consensus was being interpreted by his British peers as a lack of fundamental military decisiveness. He needed to prove he could act as a hard-nosed military arbiter, not just a consensus builder. The necessity for change became inescapable, and by March 5, 1943, Eisenhower took the decisive step of purging his incompetent leadership, signaling that the era of diplomatic compromise had ended. He ordered the removal of Lloyd Fredendall from his post, a move that was as much about signaling a new standard of accountability as it was about tactical necessity. In his place, Eisenhower turned to a man whose reputation for battlefield aggression was legendary, Major General George S. Patton. To support Patton and ensure he had a reliable pair of eyes on the ground, Eisenhower appointed Major General Omar Bradley as his deputy. Patton's arrival was felt almost instantly as he began to enforce a rigorous discipline, mandating the constant use of helmets, proper uniforms, and the relocation of command posts from the safety of the rear to the proximity of the front lines. It was an attempt to restore the fighting spirit of the American soldier, a quality the British had openly questioned in their private communications. Yet, even as the reorganization began, the British High Command remained deeply skeptical of whether these changes would be enough to fix the fundamental American problem. General Sir Harold Alexander, who had been placed in command of the new 18th Army Group, still looked upon the U.S. Second Corps with profound doubt, describing its state as a terrible shambles. The question remained, could the American Army truly overcome its tactical adolescence? Or was the British assessment of their inherent limitations, however harsh, actually correct? The arrival of George S. Patton into the chaotic vacuum of the U.S. Second Corps was not merely a change in personnel, it was the start of a psychological and operational revolution. Patton understood, with an intuition born of long study, that the primary casualty at Kasserine had not been equipment or terrain. It had been the American military's own self-belief. He recognized that the terrible shambles described by Alexander was, at its core, a failure of command presence. Patton immediately pushed his headquarters forward, effectively ending the era of Speedy Valley isolation, and mandated a culture of aggressive engagement that left no room for the hesitation that had plagued Fredendall. Patton's transformation of the Second Corps was relentless. He enforced a harsh, uncompromising standard of field discipline that, while abrasive to some, served the essential purpose of forging a cohesive unit out of fragmented battalions. Every soldier, from the cook to the tank commander, was made to understand that they were now part of an offensive machine, not a defensive shell-shocked entity. This shift was not lost on the British High Command, yet their initial response was one of watchful, deeply cynical observation. They were waiting to see if Patton's tough love would crumble under the sustained pressure of German tactical proficiency. The strategic environment was further complicated by the birth of the 18th Army Group under Alexander. This centralized control was designed to prevent the catastrophic lack of coordination seen at Kasserine, but it also placed the American forces firmly under the tactical oversight of British superiors. For Patton, this was a friction point of the highest order. He was intensely aware of the "our Italians" mockery that had permeated the British officer corps, and he channeled that resentment into a singular driving goal: proving the American fighting capability on the field of battle. The first true test of this new American posture arrived with the tactical developments that would lead to the engagement at Hill 609. Before the victory that would finally silence the critics, the American 34th Infantry Division, under Major General Charles Ryder, faced a humiliating demand from the British 15th Corps commander, General John Crocker. Following a difficult and costly attempt at a frontal assault at Fonduque Pass, Crocker demanded that the 34th be pulled from the line and relegated to rear area training, a direct, public insult that struck at the heart of the American pride Patton was attempting to rebuild. Patton and Bradley refused to accept this dismissal. In a rare high-stakes display of strategic pushback, they appealed the decision directly to Alexander, arguing that the 34th had been given an impossible mission and that they possessed the capability to perform if properly supported. Alexander, likely calculating the necessity of keeping his American commanders fully invested in the coalition effort, granted the 34th a second chance to prove its worth. This was the critical turning point. The American command had asserted its right to fail, and more importantly, its right to learn. The assault on Hill 609 was to be the crucible. It was a formidable, naturally fortified position that guarded the approaches to Tunis, and the Germans had turned it into a fortress of interlocking fire. The Americans did not rely on the fragmented, timid tactics of February. Instead, they employed a masterful, synchronized application of combined arms. Sherman tanks moved in precise coordination with infantry, while concentrated massed artillery fire, now a cornerstone of American doctrine, suppressed German defensive nests with brutal, overwhelming efficiency. For days, the 34th Division endured and repelled savage German counterattacks, showing a dogged professional tenacity that had been entirely absent at Kasserine. When the hill finally fell, the victory was total, and the symbolic impact on the Allied coalition was profound. The mockery of "our Italians" withered, replaced by a begrudging, then increasingly genuine respect from the British officer corps. The Americans had finally demonstrated that they were not merely partners in name, but a capable, professionalized fighting force. The aftermath of this transition fundamentally altered the course of the war. Eisenhower, having navigated the storm of British contempt, had emerged as a different kind of leader, one who knew when to delegate to men like Patton, when to endure the friction of coalition politics, and when to demand accountability. He had used the disaster at Kasserine not as an excuse, but as a lever to force the professionalization of his army. The lessons learned in the Tunisian mud would directly inform the strategic planning for the invasion of Sicily and the subsequent liberation of Europe. Yet, we must ask, was the British mockery entirely without merit, or was it a symptom of a deeper, inevitable conflict between two different philosophies of war? The British, having endured years of retreat and scarcity, prioritized the methodical preservation of their forces, whereas the American command structure, fueled by an abundance of material, was naturally prone to favoring direct, high-intensity offensives. Kasserine exposed the friction between these two worldviews, and it was only through the crucible of failure that they were eventually synthesized into a truly global Allied command doctrine. The resolution of this crisis also highlights a critical leadership dilemma. At what point does diplomatic consensus in a coalition become a strategic liability? Eisenhower's initial hesitance to impose his will upon his subordinates and his British superiors was, in many ways, an extension of his role as a grand strategist. Yet the events of early 1943 proved that without the willingness to purge incompetence and demand excellence, The best laid plans are nothing more than paper. Consider the consequences had Fredendall remained in command. The U.S. Second Corps likely would have continued to underperform. The British would have continued to relegate American forces to secondary roles, and the momentum required for the eventual defeat of the Axis in North Africa would have been dangerously delayed. The decision to remove Fredendall was perhaps the single most important tactical decision Eisenhower made during the entire North African campaign. This is the hidden story of how an Allied coalition, on the brink of catastrophic division and failure, found the strength to reshape itself in the heat of battle. It is the story of how the sting of condescension can, when properly channeled, transform into the steel of resolve. The Americans had been tested, they had failed, and in the process they had learned the most vital lesson of the war. That leadership is not just about the plans you make, but about the culture you enforce when everything is going wrong. The final resolution of the American problem was cemented not by further debate, but by the surrender of over 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia in May 1943. The coalition had worked. The American military was no longer a shambles, but a battle-tested partner that had earned its place at the table. The secret mockery of the British had vanished, replaced by the grim, unspoken reality that they were all now truly a single, unstoppable force. Could another commander have navigated the path Eisenhower took? It remains a provocative question, one that centers on the unique blend of political finesse and military pragmatism that defined his command style. He had to balance the ego of the British leadership against the raw, untapped potential of the American force, all while under the constant, unforgiving pressure of Rommel's tactical mastery. In the end, the defeat at Kasserine was the necessary fire that burned away the pretenses of both the American and British commands. It forced the Americans to grow, and it forced the British to accept them as peers. This transformation remains one of the most significant, yet often overlooked chapters of the Second World War, a reminder that even the most powerful alliances are forged not in the comfort of headquarters, but in the chaotic, unforgiving, and truth-telling reality of the front line. Do you think Eisenhower's diplomatic approach to the British High Command was a necessary compromise to keep the Allied coalition together? Or did it dangerously delay the professionalization of the U.S. Army in 1943? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.